freelance. You can find my stuff on my website or here on YouTube or on Instagram. Essentially, I'm a pattern cutter and I like to teach pattern cutting. I am joined by Charlotta.
Hello everybody, I'm Charlotta from the Charlotta School of Pattern Cutter. I'm a fashion designer, pattern cutter, and mostly now a teacher. And like Catherine, I love sharing all things pattern cutting because I think everybody needs to learn to draft. I'm sure you agree, Kate, as you know, everybody will profit from learning how to draft because once you know it, you can make anything. And today we're going to talk about something which will definitely help you in your drafting.
Yeah, so for anyone not familiar with what Drafting Diaries is, this is a monthly series that Charlotta and I do. We do a free YouTube live chat like this one, and then we have 2 sessions over on Zoom, which are paid for sessions where we teach you how to draft one of the styles that we talk about today. And we have another session, which is a construction session. We talk about construction and all those kinds of things. So this month, we are talking about clever bias patterns. So that includes geometric and spiral bias and all the fun bias things that you can think of. So we're going to go for designs that are creative and fun and interesting. We're not going to go for your bog standard bias cut, skirt or slip because frankly, we all know how to do that. If you don't, there is loads of information out there as well that can help you do that. So we're going to talk about square bias cutting, spiral bias cutting, and mixing it up a little bit as well, and how you can add extra details.
Yes. So I was going to say, sorry, but it's distracted. I'm just trying to find our images so we can actually share some images as well. Yeah, so do you want to get started, Kate, on what basic bias pattern cutting is?
Okay, so for anyone not familiar with what bias cutting is, bias basically is the 45-degree angle grain. So on our piece of fabric, we have the warp and we have the weft, and the bias sits exactly 45 degrees in between those two. Normally on a pattern, you'll have your grain sitting parallel to your center front or center back, and that means that the grain of your fabric, the warp of your fabric runs down your body. On a bias pattern, you would have your grain line at a 45-degree angle to your center front or center back. And then when you cut your piece on your fabric, you'll find that the warp and the weft run at a 45-degree angle down your body. Exactly. So what this means is that natural give that we have in the fabric, because when our fabric is woven like this, pulling at a 45-degree angle, it moves like this. So that natural give that we have creates movement. It creates a little bit of stretch kind of through our fabric. And that movement can sculpt to the body. It can be used to stretch. It can be used in so many different fun ways.
Yeah, and it was before we had like jersey and high-tech fabric like performance wear knits. This was a way of how you could get really comfortable but fitted clothes. Which is why we see it quite a lot of, in the 1930s and 20s, where sort of people went away from the corsets and they got excited about clothes which sort of clung to the body and were comfortable to there. And Kate already explained it fantastically, of course, because she is the expert in bias. But one thing you probably should start out with is that bias works really well for most designs we use. It's like all the drapey silks. So in a canvas, you can use bias for certain reasons, but where it really comes to its most amazing results is by drafting with it in silks, anything drapey, soft, fluid.
Yeah. If you're thinking evening wear, like sexy, slicky dresses, bias cut works perfectly for those.
And of course, actually, it's also amazing where you want to add a bit more ease. So men's shirts at the other end. The back yoke in the UK is always cut on the bias. So you have a little bit of movement. And you can cut roll collars on the bias again. So they fold over nicely. But 90% of the time, it's for sort of clingy dresses, tops as well. I always think really nice, easy to wear tops to works well.
Yeah. And where you'll see it in the high street is things like bias slips or bias camis, the tops. You'll see it on things like cowls, those kinds of things. Those gorgeous like satin body skimming dresses that are really in and have been for a little while. They're all bias cut dresses.
Yeah.
That sort of natural hugging and shaping to the body and clinging to the body, but not being skin tight. That's a bias cut.
Yes, and that's where the most basic one is. That's the one we didn't want to cover because you can find hundreds of sewing patterns if you want to. All books cover it, and yeah, it's so exciting. We wanted to have a bit of fun, to do a little bit of sort of innovative, creative pattern cutting today, or share ideas about it.
Exactly, our favorite kind of pattern cutting. So we were going to start with squares. Charlotte, do you want to kick us off?
Yes. So the queen of pattern cutting is, of course. So I've got so much stuff on my table. Is of course Madeline Vianette, and I'm very lucky to have the book. If you haven't, you can find lots of images online as well. And what's interesting, of course, as well, what we should probably say when it comes to buy, a lot of it is draped. So Vinette always draped on the bodice. So some of the techniques she uses are actually, you can see, they come from couture. They come from being hand stitched originally, and draped on the body. So it's, some of them don't translate that well, or they're quite tricky to translate, but they're a great way to get inspired. And one of her most favorite dresses is, trying to find this, is this dress, which is literally 4 squares, and I've made a little sample 12 for you all. And mine is much shorter because you actually need to use a very big square. But you can see there's just 4 squares which are cut on the, they actually cut on all the edges are on the straight, so they won't sag or fray. They actually sit nice, but it's actually stitched on the bias, which I always find quite fascinating. But then you basically wear it with a belt, and it sort of becomes a typical 1920s 30s dress where it's just, it clings, but it's all these layers, but it doesn't become bulky because the whole fabric, everything is on the bias, so you can belt it in and it won't be stiff. It will sort of fold down in these lovely flounces. And of course you can, that's one of the most basic ones, but then it's sort of one of those which gets reinterpreted again and again. So this is a sack posen where you don't actually have a square. So Kate, do you want to talk about this a bit? Because it's one of those ones where they've done a compromise between having a square and what actually works best for the body, I think.
Yeah. So the benefits of working with a square is that you can have the bias grain running down the body, and that's what gives that natural movement, that lovely fluidity. And the actual edges of the square are on your warp and your weft. So they're on your grain and your cross grain, which makes them really easy to stitch, which is great, right? But obviously squares are quite voluminous. So if you don't want to have lots of volume, if you want to shape your bias cut geometric pieces to your body, you're going to have to compromise. So these long diamond pieces will have the bias grain running down the center front. And then the edges, the diamond edges, will be kind of somewhere between bias and on the grain line, which makes them kind of tricky to stitch. So this will be a high-end piece that involves lots of hours, but it does create a really beautiful shape like that. And another benefit of working like that is that you can use those seams to really shape in that garment. So those diamond shapes, those edges will be more or less straight, and then you'll probably find that the darker ones will have slightly curved edges that then stitch to the straight ones, which then cinches it all in, makes it really hug the body beautifully.
And I think that's where you can start off with somebody like Vianette, which is quite a purist one, where you have just rectangles and square. If you look at it, some of hers isn't actually as pure as we like to think, but you can actually use the same method, but then use your flat pattern cutting skills to do a bit of shaping. Or if you're draping, you can actually, of course, do more fitting. But you can use the sort of geometric shapes on your flat pattern cutting, and then also add your normal dart manipulation, as Kate said, to make it a bit tighter. Of course, as soon as you move away from the square, it gets trickier to stitch because these pointy bits would be quite that crossover to get. Even there you can see that's not perfectly stitched because it is really hard. I wanted to show another example where I sort of gone with the idea of Vianette, but this is a high street shop, so you can see they've used it where it actually sort of looks high impact on the skirt. So that skirt is very similar to a let me find the image, to a sort of original 1920s design like this, but they've made it so it's much easier to stitch and also to fit commercially. Because that's when Kate and I were looking at contemporary stuff. We noticed most of it still have side seam, so it might have all these amazing geometric shapes or spiral shapes, but then they just put in normal side seams and completely defeat the process of the creative pattern cutting. But of course, as Kate pointed out, that way it's a lot easier to fit and also to stitch commercially, because you can stitch your front and back separately and press it and then put it all together and put your zip in.
Yeah, and no factory will thank you for giving them a bias garment.
No.
Even the simple ones, my factory's always rolling their eyes at me.
And we could, sorry, I was going to say, in our second lesson, we're going to talk a bit more construction. And we also, in the lesson, we're going to talk quite honestly probably about production sewing versus creative sewing, and how you can actually, as probably making your own clothes, you can be a lot more high end than most of the stuff you will buy in the shops, because you got the time.
Oh yeah. So I've got one more example to put with the kind of square geometric shapes, and it's this one here. I'm sorry, I'm showing on my laptop. And you can see we're still using the squares, but in a different way. So we're using those straight edges going diagonally across the body and fitting those squares together differently. And if this wasn't on the bias, then it wouldn't look very nice. It wouldn't hang very nicely. All that volume would puff out and be really not very nice. But this is such a gorgeous example of using squares and bias lines and your straight grain to help you stitch it, and in a really creative way. Because this one, the top piece will be a square with a neck hole cut in it, and then everything else will be modelled from there.
When is it from, Kate?
This is a Madame Grey one.
From 30s, because I was going to say, love, it's upside down Madame Grey, like a dolman sleeve nearly shape, but it ends up looking like 1980s sportswear.
Yes, it really does.
It has that comfort of the 80s, but it's made from silk, so it's a bit more elegant. I was going to go as well with the rectangle. It's a really good way of playing around with yourself. It's just to get rectangles of different sizes and see whether you make you can make a really nice full skirt, or you can start even gathering it. And one of my students shared the Tony Birch example, but you can have, if you start moving it up again, you can use bias in lots of different ways and just start experimenting. It's a really nice way of using geometric shapes and just see what happens if I turn it upside down, what happens if I cut a hole in, and just restricting yourself and seeing what shapes you can make, or maybe just adding a few details. Hello, Suzanne.
Agreed. Yeah, using geometrics and bias is a really fun way to experiment. And if you don't want to cut into really expensive fabric, just like a really cheap satin works really, really well. Even like a lining fabric.
All of my samples are made from lining fabrics.
Perfect. Love that.
And a fun fact, I think John Galliano made his whole BA collection out of lining fabric.
Really?
Have I got it right? Or even his BA collection, one of his first Paris collections with Kate Moss. Actually, was the one. It's made of black lining fabric because he was so poor.
Right. Okay, nice.
And if you look at it, you think, ooh. Oh, there you go. Somebody just said the way John Galliano describes his his bias pattern cutting is surreal. Yeah. So off my thing, if you have a technique that good, you can actually use really cheap fabric and it still looks amazing.
Yeah. Okay, so the second type of bias design we wanted to talk about was a spiral bias design. Now, a really good example of this is Holston. He would use spirals in lots and lots of designs, and that would just spiral around the body. So the specific example we wanted to talk about today is when it's cut in almost one piece, so one rectangle. And there we go. Charlotte's made a beautiful little sample. I love that you've made these samples. They're so gorgeous.
No, it's like Kate and I were saying, we don't get the chance to play around. So this is a really nice way of playing around it. So you can see this is the typical one. I'm going to show you the pattern because it is really clever. So it's literally a long pointy rectangle which you cut completely off a straight of grain. So it would probably be half your fabric width and just a long strip. So it's incredibly economical with fabrics. And then I actually found a way of making it zero waste, because I know people always love zero waste. Because what I don't like about it is that it has these pointy ends. So if you actually cut the top half off, that makes another rectangle which you can put right at the bottom. It's the same size, so you literally end up by just using a rectangle, and all you cut out is like little half circles for your neckline.
I love that.
About zero waste. Yeah, it basically becomes 99% zero waste, and you can see all you get is actually another seam at the back, which is actually really nice, because I always think, because you use a straight strip, it's actually quite a plain dress. So
yeah,
you chop it up a bit, you actually get like a few more sort of lines in a way which are more interesting. And also you could maybe do a bit of fitting, because that's the one thing we both said with the Holston, is that it's like you would need an even more fluid fabric like that, and you have to really experiment. So this is just my bust circumference. You probably need to really make that slightly tighter so it clings to the body.
Yeah, I was going to say that extra seam that you've added actually would work really well to do a bit of fitting through there, and you could kind of curve the seam a little bit and maybe do some little tweaks through there. That would work really well, I think.
Yes, because you always get that, like you get quite a bit of gaping and that sort of slightly floppy back, isn't it? Which
yeah.
But it's like a really good way of using spiral cutting. And I actually looked at some, let's see where I download it. I didn't. And there's some Holston Heritage, and they're doing the same thing, but they're just adding little bits of like, for example, you could make the bottom half, if you add volume in, it becomes like a sort of flounce again. Oh, and people are just talking about the John Galliano films. So so yeah, people like that are always amazing to listen to, if actually, and because of John Galliano now teaches more or less full time, I think. He's probably really used to sharing it and sort of talking about how it all works.
One last thing I was going to say about the spiral design, because you've got that seam running through, a really nice detail that I've seen is people cut a bias, a flat bias piping, and they put it through the seam as well. So you get that nice contrast spiraling around the body, which is a really gorgeous way to do it.
And we also found this really nice Jason Wu from about 2014. And that's sort of, it's using the Holston idea, but then it's adding basically again like sort of spiral cut flounces both at the shoulder line and further down, to add a bit more volume. But this is actually one of those that has side seams, so it's using the inspiration of Holston, but then it's making it more commercial, because again, as Kate said, this might be like deceptively easy to draft, but actually to fit it and then stitch it so everything hangs nicely, it's slightly more difficult.
It's always that way, isn't it? The things that are easy to draft are the hardest ones to fit, because you're like, well, where do I put the shaping? How do I do this?
But it's one of those where if it's on a catwalk model, then it's easier to fit. But if you actually want to fit it to your own individual body, you suddenly you have to sort of be more precise to a certain degree.
Yeah.
And somebody
I just saw it. Oh, go on. How do you? I just saw a question about asking for tips for how to sew bias on a domestic machine. So we're actually going to have a whole separate session about construction and sewing tips, and that is session number 3. You can book that if you go to the link. It's in the description of this live, and you can book a place on my website to have access to that. And like I said, the whole session is about construction, so be packed full of tips and tricks.
Yes, and you can either book both of them, drafting or construction, or if you just want construction, you can do that. We also then, like Holston is the most sort of famous one. We also want to look at a few more sort of examples where it's sort of pushed further. I really like this Ossie Clark from the 60s.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. So
That's
there
really
you,
gorgeous.
he's used fabric incredibly well. So it's two fabrics, one with big flowers, one with small flowers, and they sort of snake around the body. And I actually made 12. But this is a different, this is a sort of skirt version where you have 6 panels and they basically sneak around the body. And this was a really basic draft. It takes 5 minutes to make because it's really straightforward. But you can see again, then you would actually have to have a look at fitting it all and how to actually take it out so it fits nicely. And I think that's why often bias is used on dresses, because with dresses it can skim. With a skirt, you actually have to fit it to your waist.
Yeah, yeah. And if you think about like the simple bias cut skirts that we can buy on the high street now, they normally have an elastic in the waist, so that kind of hikes it all in. But if you're doing a beautiful spiral cut like this, don't ruin it by putting an elastic in the waist.
No.
Like, it's just, this is a couture way of pattern cutting, so finish it in a couture way. And you can, with those seams, you can incorporate a bit of shaping here and there. It just takes a little bit of fiddling.
Yes.
And it also means that some of your panels might not be the same width all the way down. They might be slightly narrower at the top. So just bear that in mind if you're doing like that Aussie Clark design and using contrast fabrics.
And then, of course, that is the whole point of as well making yourself. You can actually make it to fit you perfectly, rather than, you know, having to buy something that's elastic so it fits everybody at the same time.
Yeah. And I love the detail on that skirt as well, the flounce through the hem. That's definitely something to note, that with these spiral cuts, the most basic one that we showed you, of course, is just a rectangle, but you can take that further and you can add fullness into those strips onto the bottom of them to create beautiful godets and really get that flounce in there as well.
But what is nice is, again, it grows out of each strip. So on this skirt, every single seam is almost straight of grain. So it's got all the beautiful sort of clinginess of bias, and you got, of course, bias on the waist, bias on the hem, but apart from it, all the seams are straight. So it's actually really easy to stitch compared to stitching your 45-degree angle bias seams.
Yeah, it's a dream, isn't it, compared to
Looks complicated, very easy. And I think we always have to do a bit of fitting, so you know that's actually not too bad. Let me have a look. I went a bit mad. I was saying to Kate I was having lots of fun, so
yeah, I just kept getting lots of photos from Charlotte and be like, look what I've done, look what I've made.
So this is the same skirt. This is a similar sort of type of skirt, but this time it's just in straight. But you can see again, this is just a normal basic A-line skirt. But again, all the seams are on the straight of grain, but the thing hangs on the bias. You can really play around with stuff like that. Which is where you also, I was thinking it'd be really nice to do sleeves, for example. Stuff like that.
Or, you know, you could do like a grown-on sleeve and do the spiral cut going from kind of like across one bust up over the shoulder and then have that wrapping around. That would be really nice.
Gaga's done one. I've done it on my membership. But the whole garment's actually cut on the straight. But then you just have that sleeve. It's sort of near like a grown-on sleeve. Bias cutting in menswear.
No, not off the top of my head.
No, not of his stream. Sorry, Sean. I would imagine Westwood, because actually we haven't done any Westwood on here, but Westwood does some really good bias pattern cutting.
Yeah, I would say Westwood's slightly more like constructed bias rather than like geometric bias.
Yeah, I don't do silky
bias. More like big drapes. Yeah.
It's wool, basically, like tailoring, but cut on the bias to make it more exciting.
Yeah, which is arguably even more exciting because, you know, it's taking a whole new area and transforming it into a creative area of pattern.
And it's not something you could wear every day. Like, I know you can dress up and down your slinky tops and dresses, but yeah, different fabrics, different uses.
Okay, so that's all of our examples that we were going to speak about, isn't it, Charlotte?
Yes. But I wanted to quickly finish off because we've sort of gone quite like squares and spiral. What I quite like is when the stuff gets combined. So people actually use purposely things on the bias and then purposely things on the straight. And it always works really well in stripes. So this is a 1940s example. So now you put our Pinterest board in the description, didn't you?
I did, yeah.
It's a really nice example, but they're basically done it amazingly well. How you have some seams cut on the bias, so your stripes meet, and then you got other seams on the sleeve, which you actually really play with what's straight of grain, what's on the bias, how you can create this square shape by a stripe fabric. So it's really clever. And then there's a really good contemporary example, which is a Haida Ackerman, which might actually be knit. But again, this is a sort of really clever, and it's got that sort of grown-on sleeve on the bias. You were talking about the raglan sleeve, hasn't it?
Yeah. I think it is a knit. For looking at how the raglan is sitting, I think it is a knit. But I love that idea of using stripes, and you can see how it's kind of like contours the body.
It's like a fleecy knit.
Yeah, kind of like a bit fluffy almost.
Yes, very, very clever, because then it suddenly becomes much more interesting, doesn't it?
Yeah. That must have been a lot of fun trying to match that centre front seam.
Yes, but it's like there on the sides, that's like your sort of rectangular square pattern cutting, but then they've combined it to make it a sort of pure psychedelic stripes, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And it's really nice that line really contours in the body. Gives that real illusion of a small waist.
Yeah, because if you compare it to the sack posen, where everything is sort of rectangular. So diagonal cardigan. Can you read? I can't actually see that.
Hang on, let me open it again. It disappears really quickly. So it's a machine knit technique.
Oh, that would make sense.
We call it diagonal cardigan stitch, creates a bias knit. Oh, that's really interesting.
Yes.
Thank you, Sean. I didn't know that. Knits done through partial knitting on the machine, easy to match on the centre front. Ah, even better.
That makes complete sense, because then you can exactly say like 4 stitches are always matched. So
yeah,
not like in sewing when you have to match it. You can literally match it to the stitch, can you? So thank you for that. That's really interesting. So I wonder if the whole thing is, so maybe it's partly fully fashioned, but like you can see where the panels come in on the sides. It's definitely just normal stitching there, because you can actually see that it isn't that well done in parts.
So we have another question here. Are wool coats ever inclined to have bias design incorporated? Wool coats are
Charles James.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm having technical difficulties. I can't get the comments off my page.
Yes.
Anyway, yes, they are more creative and particularly vintage designers who use a lot of bias cut wool, because what it does is it just falls a little bit softer. So if you've got a lot of volume in your coat, having it on the bias grain just makes any folds or any more three-dimensional shapes that you're trying to draft just fall a little bit softer.
This is a jacket, not a coat, but this is a Claire McCardle design, I think, and it's just completely, it's a really basic design, but it's cut on the bias, and then it just drapes nicely. So, and there's a beautiful Charles James where he does like a tailored coat, but he cuts like a big check and he cuts on the bias, and then it just, suddenly becomes very fitted and sort of shaped and very soft, so deconstruction before the Italians caught up to it. Ahead of his time.
And of course, your back undercollar will be cut on bias normally as well. Again, just to mold when it folds over and kind of really move around the neck. And I think Charlotte mentioned at the beginning, like roll collars and things like that are often cut on bias.
Yoke. Yeah, so it can be very subtle and clever, or it can actually be where you make the whole design bias and play around with it.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so has anyone else got any questions? I think we've probably missed a couple. There were quite a few coming through while we were chatting, so I'll just quickly have a scooch through to see if there's anything I missed. But if you have got any questions, pop in the chat now.
Yeah, because I can't see anything. I can just see as they turn up and then disappear.
So there's one here from Erin. Does bias cut continue to grow and stretch? Yes, it does, but less over time, if that makes sense. So when you initially cut your fabric, what you should do is hang your pieces to allow them to drop. and then make your garment and then level it off. If you keep your bias garments hanging in your closet, they will slowly stretch over time, but by small amounts. So generally, my advice, and advice a lot of my clients give people, if you have bias dresses, is to hang them, but loop the bottom over, the trouser bit of your hanger, just to minimize the amount of weight that's hanging off of that bias.
Yes. And you can also, we're going to talk about in our lessons, you can sort of hang it and stuff if you're making your own stuff, can you? Good. And we got the bias cut woman, which you should, if you don't follow her Instagram, do have a look at her account. Kate and I were talking about the show, how much we love the 3D design she does, and she's doing a whole series of Vionette. So you can see all these amazing Vionette designs come to life by magic. Lots of hard work, I imagine.
On the 3D fitting software as well, which I'm super excited to see. I can't wait to learn that as well. So I'll be joining you soon, hopefully, Bias Cut Woman in the 3D world.
And she's actually saying some Scottish tartan trousers or waistcoats are bias cut if you talk about menswear.
Ooh.
Yes, I've seen some of, again, it makes it's quite, you see, yes, I've seen some of it. And actually, you give us trousers, we haven't talked about it, but you can do some really amazing stuff with bias cutting there as well. Both with geometrics or spiral for different ends.
Yeah, love that. Okay, so I think that's all the questions. I can't see any that I've missed through there, but if I have, now's your chance, pop it in there and let me know. But otherwise, remember that this is the first of 3 series. So this one, of course, is here. The next 2 are happening on Zoom. If you want to book your place for those, you can do it via my website. The link is in the description. And we will both be putting it in our stories on Instagram as well, if you want to go and have a look there. There is a discount if you book both sessions. Separately, they are £10 each. Together, they are £17. So there is a little
bargain because you get both of us basically for an hour.
Yeah.
Yes.
Buy one, get one free.
Yes. So what we're basically looking at is a improved version of a Halston dress you can draft on the flat to your measurements with fitting incorporated in your flat pattern cutting. So we're taking the same idea of spiral pattern cutting, but then adding a fitting already in the flat pattern cutting process, so you can add it to, shape it to your own body. And we're also going to talk about how you can adapt it to add the flounce if you want it. But it's a really clever way you can draft flat pattern cut bias and fit it at the same time. And you can, once you learn how to do it, you can also use it for skirts or sleeves or trousers.
Yeah, it's a great technique.
Yes, and it's one because we were talking about it. Most books have some bias cutting. It's all the same. This is a method I learned at St. Martin's. I haven't seen anywhere else, so I thought it's high time we share it.
Definitely share the secrets. And then session 3 is going to be where we talk about all the construction. So that'll be things like sewing tips, like we touched on, kind of hanging your garment and things like that, fabrics, all those little tips and tricks, like leveling your hems, all of that. That construction side of things we'll be talking about in session number 3.
And one thing we haven't mentioned, which people always ask for, everything will be recorded. So if you can't make it, time zones, whatnot, then you get recording afterwards. So, but I think live is always the best because you can ask questions afterwards if things don't make sense, or in the chat while one of us is drafting. So it's a really nice interactive session, and we hope to see some of you there next Tuesday. It's the same time, just in a week's time.
Yeah, hopefully see you guys next week, and I hope you enjoyed this session.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye everybody, good night.